12 September 1945, the day the Japanese occupation of Singapore ended. In the municipal building, the Japanese delegation, led by Shiseido Itagaki, formally surrendered to Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten. While the local population cheered the return of the British, the horror of the first bombing still rang in their ears. The Japanese first attacked Singapore at 4 a.m. on the 8th of December 1941. Their main targets were the airfields, but Raffles Place was also bombed, catching many civilians unaware.
I remember going to work, driving to St. Andrew's School, and many of the telegraph poles had fallen, and I saw bodies lying on the ground, bombed victims, writhing in pain.
That particular morning, I was going to sit for my Cambridge exam, and the subject was Empire of the British, history of the British Empire. So we all students joked among ourselves and thought, my goodness, the British Empire is going to be shattered.
2 days later, the Japanese sank 2 British ships off Kuantan. With no air cover, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse were easy targets. The myth of British invincibility went down with the ships. The Japanese attacked Singapore from the north, where her defense was weakest. They relied on strategy and speed. On the evening of the 8th of February 1942, 3 Japanese divisions crossed the Straits of Johor and established a foothold on the northwestern shore. By the 9th of February, Tengah airfield was in Japanese hands. 3 days later, the battle for Bukit Timah and the vital reservoirs was lost. On the 13th of February, despite gallant resistance by a Malay regiment, the Japanese broke through their defense at Pasir Panjang, and the whole city was within their reach. Singapore was on fire. Since January, air raids had increased in intensity, killing many civilians. With pipes damaged, most areas of town had no water. Civilians watched in bewilderment as Singapore fell. Without air raid shelters, many died from the constant bombing and shelling. All was confusion and despair. The casualties found no room in the hospitals.
Our hospitals were full. The wounded were just stretched out in the corridors, some of them with ghastly wounds. Mouth split right open, right to the throat. The mortuary was piled up right to the ceiling. It's impossible to describe the fearful number of casualties, and both civilian and military.
On Sunday, the 15th of February, a British delegation met the Japanese at the Ford factory in Bukit Timah to arrange a ceasefire. After an hour of confused argument, Yamashita compelled Percival to accept unconditional surrender. The British had been defeated, even though their troops outnumbered the Japanese. Singapore fell on the first day of the Chinese New Year. The island was renamed Sionan, or Light of the South. The Japanese occupation of Singapore had begun. Just 3 days after the surrender, the Japanese conducted a screening operation known as Suk Ching, which means to purge or eliminate. Chinese men between the ages of 18 and 50 were told to report to registration camps. The Chinese were singled out as some had supported China in its war effort against Japan. Those who passed the screenings had square marks stamped on them. Elizabeth Choi was among the families herded into a concentration camp at Arab Street.
We were there for several days. And at last, the Kempitai officer said, all right, all women and young children can go home. So we had to pass through a gate, and as we passed, each hand was given a chop. When my father, who was about 50 odd, when he passed through the gate and my brother was following, my brother was stopped. He was not allowed to pass, and he was in tears. He said, Daddy, are you going to leave me behind? There's no way. He was not allowed to go. And my father came home, and my brother was never seen or heard of after that. Don't know what happened to him.
Those identified as anti-Japanese were massacred en masse in remote areas like Changi and Punggol. Till today, it's not known how many Chinese died in the massacre. The Japanese official figure was 5,000, but the local estimate was 25,000 to 50,000. Elizabeth Choi and her husband, married just before the war, operated a canteen at a hospital at Tan Tock Seng. As sick British internees were allowed to be treated at the hospital, the couple helped to pass food, medicine and money to British prisoners in Changi. This landed them into trouble with the Kempitai, the Japanese military police. Elizabeth and her husband were brought to the Kempitai headquarters.
Every day a few people from the cell would be taken out for interrogation, and for torturing, and their cries of agony, it's painful to hear. And very often, I myself was taken out, and they applied electricity on me, try to get me to admit. And my husband was brought to kneel beside me and said, now both of you, you must admit that you gave information to the military. Both of us said, no, we did not. So after much investigation, nearly a year, so one day I was called for interrogation. And the officer said to me, yes, we will release you because we have been asking everybody, and now we believe that what you had done was out of humanitarian purpose. So we will let you go.
The Japanese saw education as the most profound means of propaganda. They introduced a Japanese-style curriculum in primary schools. English was replaced by Nihongo, or the Japanese language. Students were taught to sing patriotic Japanese songs, and Japanese lessons were given on the radio. Local teachers were required to learn Japanese. Some Singaporeans enrolled themselves in the classes, hoping that the Japanese would be better disposed towards them. During the Japanese occupation, basic foodstuff, especially rice, became extremely scarce. Ration cards were issued to control the supply of rice and other essentials. Each adult's monthly ration was 8 katis, or 4.8 kilograms of rice. But in early 1944, the ration was reduced to 6 katis.
Rice was a very important commodity. I believe that the Japanese authority used rice as a kind of a weapon to seek population's cooperation with the army.
By 1945, the prices of consumer goods had risen astronomically since their pre-war level. The price of eggs rose 500 times and rice 1,000 times. Rice became a priceless commodity.
When rice are being taken from the go down along the Singapore Harbour Board, the lorry has to pass through Cantonment Road area where I used to live. And there were many elderly Chinese women who used to sweep the road for rice which fell off from the lorries. We never imagined that war could bring such a situation of lifestyle.
The health of the general population was poor. Sanitary conditions had deteriorated and piped water was contaminated. The spread of disease was rampant.
The most common, I think, was tuberculosis in all stages. Then, of course, you had all the diarrheas and the malnutrition. That came up a bit later on, more and more cases of malnutrition. We had the bacterial diseases, we had typhoid, we had dysenteries. And the amazing thing is we've never had so many of these cases as during the occupation.
Towards the end of the war, living conditions became increasingly unbearable as food supplies dwindled. The Japanese currency depreciated rapidly due to overprinting. The tide of war was turning against the Japanese. The atomic bombs which fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki put an end to the Japanese occupation. On the 5th of September 1945, British and Commonwealth troops returned to Singapore. They received a tumultuous welcome. The same Union Jack was hoisted over the city, but it was a different Singapore to which the British returned in 1945. They were welcomed back with genuine relief, but the old loyalty and unquestioning trust in British protection had been shattered. A political awakening had taken place. After Singapore's defeat and 3.5 years of Japanese occupation, the people no longer regarded the British as infallible or superior. In another 10 years, the leaders of a new generation would emerge. People who had experienced the shock of the surrender, the horror of war, and the exhilaration of post-war winds of change. Leaders who would challenge the British right to rule.